Good morning. My name is Don Michaelman, and I want to welcome you to the October 10th, 2024 meeting of the Planning and Zoning Commission of the City of Prescott. I'd like to welcome Councilmember Gambogi attending, and I would like to have the commission members introduce themselves, and I'll start with Susan.
Good morning. I'm Susan Graham.
Good morning, Tom Riley.
Good morning, Tom Hutchison.
If you could check your cell phones and make sure they're off or muted, would appreciate that. This is an open public hearing and is being videotaped by the city. The proceedings are being televised by representatives of the public media, the public and local cable and/or radio stations, and may also be rebroadcast. The number of commissioners present is 4. It will require a majority vote of those present to pass a motion. Members of the public, when called upon, are required to state their name and address for the record so that we may know who is speaking and be able to contact them at a later date if necessary on this. First item on the agenda is the minutes of the September 12th, 2024 Planning and Zoning Commission meeting minutes. Are there any corrections to the minutes? If no corrections, is there a motion concerning the minutes?
Mr. Chairman, move to approve the minutes as presented.
Motion to approve. Is there a second?
Tom Hutchison, I second.
We have a motion to approve and second. Any further discussion? Jacob, would you call the roll?
Commissioner Hutchison?
Yes, I approve.
Commissioner Graham?
Abstain since I was absent.
Vice Chair Riley?
Approve.
Chair Michaelman?
Approve. Next on the agenda is LDC 24001, proposed amendment to the Land Development Code affecting accessory dwelling units. Kaylee, welcome back.
Thank you. I mean, I've been here, just not at PNC.
But not in that position.
Yes, not in this realm. Good morning, Chairman, Commissioners. Kaylee Nunez, Community Planner. So yes, today we have 2 Land Development Code amendments, proposals rather, to present to you. Kind of started this amendment list during COVID. It was a COVID project thing. We're always taking note of things that we could improve or adapt within our land development code. So I'm going to do an overview of both of the amendment proposals that I'll present today. So one of them is for LDC section 2.5.6. So that's for guest quarters and ADUs. And then LDC section 11.2. Table 11.2.5, and that's for the gross floor area definition. So for the ADUs, that's, it's been kind of a hot topic, not only, with the city, but regionally and nationally, to create more housing options. And then the amendment for the gross floor area is being proposed to reduce confusion, and I will go over that later in the presentation. So strike through represents text to be deleted, and underline represents text to be inserted. I'm going to hit you with a wall of text. I apologize, but we had to get it all on there. So this is the existing section regarding guest quarters. And as you can see, we tacked on and ADUs. So basically, we're inserting the term ADU a few times. And then you'll see C will be eliminated completely. So the way it stands now is guest quarters, mother-in-law units, casitas, whatever you call them, may only be utilized by guests. So that means like non-renting persons. So whether that be a family member, caretaker. However, state law precluded us from placing restrictions on short-term rentals. I don't know, it's probably been 6 years now. So we have to allow a short-term rental, which is defined as a tenancy of 30 days or less. But the language in the Land Development Code prohibits long-term, which arguably there's a greater need for. So C is eliminated completely. Again, then you see on E, there's a section that we struck through that again says such quarters shall not be utilized as separate rental units. So we kept F and G. F requires one off-street parking space. Parking is always a concern. So one space per ADU is required, in addition to the parking that's required for the primary dwelling unit. So, and then G, there's no modification to G. So that is the proposed ADU language. Here's a site plan, sample site plan found by George. So, ADUs, there's several formats of them. They can be detached, attached. This is kind of a good segue into, whoops, I'm going the wrong way. No, I wasn't. It's just stuck. Would you like to say something?
Yeah,
George?
before we go into the next topic, can you go back? Can you go back to the text? Okay.
Oh, that is a different slide.
So one of the reasons that we were looking at this initially is as a result of something that Kaylee just mentioned, the state came in a few years ago and basically said you can't prohibit short-term rental uses, vacation rental uses, on any property zoned single family in your city, and it was statewide mandate, overrode everyone's zoning code limitations. Our zoning code, to protect the single family character of the neighborhood, said if you have an accessory unit, that unit was limited to guests of the principal family. You couldn't rent it out separately. With the state preempting us and allowing for that rental to be short-term, it created a series of impacts on neighborhoods that have been adapted to over the years. Short-term rentals typically have more adverse impact on neighborhoods than long-term rentals, primarily because you have a constant change of resident in the short-term rental, as opposed to a long-term rental where you're likely to have much more stable occupancy. Not necessarily stable occupants, but stable occupancy. The intent would be to allow for that longer term use because it is not as impactful or more impactful than the already allowed use by state statute, and could, as Kaylee rightly pointed out, provide an option perhaps for smaller residential uses on single family property in addition to the principal building that we don't allow legally now. If someone comes to the front counter at City Hall and says, I want to rent out my mother-in-law suite in the backyard, we tell them you can rent it for 30 days at a time or less and not for 30 days at a time or more, which has been difficult for me to get out of my mouth on many occasions because it's just, the technical zoning term is, it's just stupid. If you're going to allow short-term uses that have higher impacts and more turnover, why wouldn't you allow long-term uses that will have lesser impacts and less turnover? So this proposal is to remove some of those barriers to allow for that use to continue. We've had a request from someone, I think he's here, he is here, Howard Mechanic, to address the paragraph D, the question regarding utilities. When we were able to control the use of those accessory dwelling units before the state statute changes. Not allowing separate utilities was a means of preventing them from being rented. It made it harder to rent the property out if it didn't have its own electric and water meters. With the state law imposition on us, the modification that they did, that also doesn't make as much sense. Allowing an additional meter is something we should do for those buildings if the private property owner chooses to do so. We have a concern in conversation among planning staff about mandating separate meters. And while separate meters are good for water conservation, they're also an expense, especially a separate connection to the city's utility system, because that would generate an impact fee. So one of the options that Mr. Mechanic came up with was, let's encourage them to sub-meter the accessory dwelling unit, the ADU. A sub-meter is a small meter. It's privately owned. It's internal to the water system within a property. It doesn't connect directly to the city system. So you have one meter that connects to the city system, feeding the main house, and then you have a second smaller meter, privately owned, that connects to the rental property, the ADU in this case. And that separate meter is something that is completely controlled, monitored by the property owner. The city is not involved in it in any way. We issue one water bill to the property, but the property owner can monitor how much water is being used by the ADU separately from the principal dwelling. And that makes sense from a conservation standpoint. If you meter something, then you are more likely to conserve it than if you don't meter it. And that's something that's been proven over time through water resources and through other metered services. So he's probably going to want to speak to you a little bit more about it, but I wanted to make sure that you understand from a staff perspective, if it's an encouragement and it's something that wouldn't cost a large amount of money, as in an impact fee, planning staff is completely behind that concept. Making it optional and addressing the other items that Kaylee's talked to you about, I think is a good way to encourage use of these properties for something that in some cases they're already being used for, and in other cases they're being used for something far more impactful in the form of vacation rentals. So my comments for the day.
Any questions from commission members of staff before we have our guest speaker? Tom?
Kaylee, this seems like this goes beyond the new state law in that it allows for long-term rental, where the state law precludes that. Am I reading that right?
No. So state law precludes us from prohibiting short-term rentals. It does not preclude us from allowing long-term rentals. And in fact, I don't know where Arizona is at with this, but there are states that have passed legislation that basically is turning residential into multifamily by allowing multiple ADUs on property. So again, no, this is not going against state law. It's just allowing another option. And when George was talking, it's like this may decrease the instance of illegal long-term rentals and encourage people to permit them properly, which is another upside.
The other thing that it seems like this is a zoning change. We're making single-family homes into multi-family.
Yes, but it's arguably you're only allowed one ADU, per residential property. And again, it's already allowed for short-term rentals or guest quarters. So these ADUs are occurring already. This is just a path to make the long-term rentals legitimate.
Kaylee, can you put the diagram slide up? So
Yes.
one of the limitations that we have in the code is ADUs are considered an accessory dwelling, accessory building on the site. So there's a maximum size allowance for them to keep them subservient to the principal building. As Kaylee said, they're already allowed to be used for short-term rental. So you've already compromised the single-family use of the property because you can now use your guest quarters as a hotel. And that's what short-term rentals are. So we see this as maybe a minor step, but because we're limiting them to the accessory unit, there is an automatic restriction in the size of the units. In cases where you're already allowed to have multiple units, Kaylee pointed out in the presentation, there's language for multifamily zoning that basically says a second unit on the site is a second unit on the site. It's not an ADU. So we think we balance those two as close as we can get them.
George, it seems like, I mean, if I had a single-family 3,000-foot home on a nice lot, and my neighbor decides to set up a rental business next door, it seems like that's a takeaway.
At this point in time, your neighbor could build a building subject to the requirements of the accessory buildings in our code, and rent it short-term without you having any say whatsoever in it. With short-term rentals, it means a turnover every day, every weekend, every week of occupants to those. So that is already an imposition on you based on state law's preemption of local zoning when it comes to short-term rentals. So this, in fact, could become a second family living on the site, but it's a second family that will be there long-term. So I don't know that the adverse impact is more, less, equal than what you have with potential for vacation rentals. I also don't think the change that we're talking about here will generate a lot of new construction of these buildings. I think what it will do is provide an incentive to people who are tired of renting their ADU out short term to have a legal alternative to rent it out long term with a stable renter, stable income, and not have to deal with the vagaries of I'm trying to get this rented out every weekend and it's out of my control half of the time in trying to do that. If there was going to be a proliferation of these, it would have occurred at the time the state law preempted us. When you could create a short-term rental, that's when we would have seen a large proliferation of them. We didn't. We saw an increase in the number of them permit-wise, but it wasn't a flood of them coming in. And I don't think this change would create a flood of them coming in for permit either.
George, if HOA prohibits having something like this or short-term, that trumps this change, wouldn't it?
It does kind of, sort of. So the way HOA rules and zoning rules are, we're the law, and the HOA rules are sitting on top of that. It's a contractual arrangement. A property owner is subject to both of those things. So if we say it's okay, but the contract they signed by joining an HOA says no, they're subject to that contract. So an HOA that prohibits them can continue to prohibit them.
Another question for Matt, maybe. Are there legal implications that are swimming around in this that are going to surface?
Yeah, we have to be careful to kind of dot our I's and cross our T's when doing this. I don't think there are legal implications concerning the general concept that we can allow for ADUs to be properly part of our land development code under the state statutes that tell a city or town you cannot prohibit short-term rentals. The kind of the opposite is true as well. You can allow for kind of long-term rentals of an ADU if you properly zoned it. I think one of the things we're going to have to look at as staff or make sure we go back and look at the definition sections of the land development code, because we don't really define an ADU necessarily. We do define an 11.13D household living, and we talk about what accessory uses are, and there we find caretakers, quarters, and guest houses, but we don't necessarily find an ADU. So I'm wondering if, when we go back and take a closer look at that, whether we have to go back and kind of amend some of these existing definitions? Or do you think, George, you're more familiar with this than I am, whether a definition exists?
So one of the things we did was try to define it here, but we could certainly create a separate category in Article 11 so that if someone's just looking for definitions, they'll find it there as well. So this is all the criteria and defining it. In here, it's basically, it's a small dwelling unit that is accessory to the principal dwelling unit. So yes, we can create a separate definition for Article 11 so that we have a clear space for someone who's just looking at definitions to find it immediately.
Yeah, and is there a distinction between now a guest quarter and an ADU?
By the changes we're making, there's no distinction.
Okay, so we'd probably have to go in and clean that up and just do the guest quarter / ADU throughout the definition section. I found 3 or 4, places where we have our definitions, and I think for consistency purposes, we want to look at that. But I don't have an overall concern with the legality of allowing it, if that was something the council were wanting to do, especially in terms of a lot of this is kind of the genesis of this is coming out of the Workforce Housing Commission, where we're looking for creative solutions that may provide additional housing units for the workforce.
Yeah, and I was going to follow up on that. Like, housing is a hot topic. It's something that the city's been wanting to promote and actually make happen. I mean, it's been talked about for decades, but like, this isn't going to solve the housing crisis, but it's like it's a bite-sized, solution. But if you get, a few bites at the apple, then it starts making a difference. So it's some progress.
Any other questions for staff? Tom?
Yeah, thank you for that, Kaylee. I think that you're absolutely correct that this is a step in the right direction. It's certainly not the solution, but it is a step in the right direction. Could you go back to the slide with the diagram, site diagram? Yes. So with the issue of the parking space, where is the parking space on here?
Well, I mean, in this case, this is kind of more ideal because it shows an alley behind the site, so you could surmisably pull up next to that ADU from the alley. But as far as what if there was an alley access, they'd have to provide it somewhere in like the front of their home.
They wouldn't be able to use the driveway because that would be a tandem parking space?
You can do tandem.
You can do tandem?
Yeah, it explicitly says so. You could do a tandem situation.
If I have a 2-car driveway? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Mr. Chair, if you'll indulge me for 1 second. George, have we been looking at what other cities and towns are starting to do with this? And maybe you can share some of that information with the commission.
Yes, we've looked at a number of other communities just to get an idea. It's something that's happening a lot in the northwest portion of the country. So we've got examples from Portland and Seattle that just show encouragements that they've created. So they've actually created funding encouragements for these things as well. We're looking at this more of a reduction in regulation as an encouragement, as opposed to actual funding of them. I know Kaylee did some review too, if you have anything you want to pitch in.
Yeah, I did research a couple of years back for one of my courses through NAU, my grad courses on ADUs. So I have a whole report on this. But again, I think I mentioned earlier, there are some cities that are moving towards eliminating single family zoning altogether. That's not what this is about.
No.
But this is something that may come down the pipeline to where we are made to allow an ADU. So it's better to do it proactively and build in kind of the protections we like. But it's certainly beyond a trend at this point. Like there are cities that are incentivizing it. Like they are literally providing plans for free. And I don't know, they might be reducing permitting costs. So this isn't anything that's like really controversial or cutting edge.
No, we're not
makes sense.
groundbreaking here. This is something that's been going on across the country for 10 years or more. In areas where housing expenses are even higher than they are here, it's tended to be a higher priority. So more changes are made in those locations. And again, one of the things that we approached it with in mind specifically was how can we allow them without changing the character of the neighborhood so that we're not getting rid of single family zoning, so to speak. And by limiting them to the accessory buildings or accessory units, we're keeping the size smaller. We're not making it a duplex property where you've got 2 full-size units with 2 full-size families allowed on the property. So combining this with the guest quarters allowances that we already have in our code made a lot of sense to keep the scale down, so reducing the impact somewhat. And again, because of Arizona's actions, much of the adverse impact that was worried about in other states was created by the state's preemption of our code, forcing us to allow short-term rentals. So once we had to allow the short-term rentals, the adverse impact happened right then. And that's been 5 years ago.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you. Sir, would you like to address?
Howard Mechanic. I appreciate George adding the suggestion about private submeters. I just want to mention, when I started looking into this, I thought there might be a considerable expense. Actually, you can find good submeters for electric, gas, and water for under $100 each. And if it's an existing unit that already is connected, it will cost something for the installation, but if it's a new unit, it's very negligible for the installation. So hopefully the city, when people come in and talk to the department, hopefully they will encourage people to look into the submeters. If you had a tenant, would you rather have them pay for what they're using, or would you rather pay for the utility bill and let them use as much as they want? If they're not being billed, they tend to use as much as they want and don't consider conservation, and conservation is important in this area. So that's why it's important. It'll save the tenant money, I think, in the long run, and save the landlord money in the long run. When the tenant knows they're paying only for what they use, I think they'll save money instead of the landlord having to raise the rent or raise the utility. I wanted to comment about the 2 reasons I would support this. And one is there was a joint meeting of the Workforce Housing Committee and the council, and a couple council members indicated concern that there might be a proliferation of short-term rentals if the ADUs were expanded in a certain way. Actually, the opposite effect is going to happen because existing people who have short-term rentals, some of them want, as George mentioned, some would like to take the opportunity to get rid of that short-term rental and have long-term rental. So I think it'll reduce the number of short-term rentals. And considering that they can already do it for new construction, they can already put in a short-term rental, why not encourage long-term? And I just wanted to briefly say that as has been mentioned by a couple people, the workforce housing situation here is very critical. You have police and fire personnel who this costs the city over $100,000 to be trained, and you have a lot of them leaving. They can't afford to live here. We have plenty of new homes that are 3,000 square feet. We don't have plenty of new homes that are 600 square feet. And maybe that's too small for what you are looking for, but it's not too small for a single person who wants to live in Prescott, who has no opportunity to find that. There's no guarantee that these ADUs will be used by workforce. They could be used by retired people who move to the area. They could be luxury units. They could be higher priced. There's no guarantee. But it will encourage, I think, lower priced units. When you have a 600 square foot unit, it's obviously going to be less money than the average unit that's being built. We need not just 50 or 60 of these type of units, and that's probably all we'll get, is my estimate. That's probably all we'll get. I don't know what other people's estimates are. But we need probably 1,000 workforce housing units. And we're going to have a study done. Council just approved that yesterday by a consultant to determine what the needs are for different income levels and different size units. You're going to find out we're short over 1,000 units of workforce housing. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Mechanic? Mr. Mechanic?
Howard?
You gave us your name. You did not give us your address.
Yeah, I submitted it for the record, and the city knows how to contact me. I've addressed city council. I have a little concern that nowadays people get addresses of people they sort of attack people for one reason or another. So if the city needs to contact me, they know how to contact me. Thank you.
Clearly.
Question. If we wanted to pursue the options of sub-meters, how would we handle that if we decide to?
The language that Kaylee's showing here that we came up with based on the input from Mr. Mechanic, included in the recommendation would I think be enough. It would encourage, even promote sub-meters, but not mandate them. So we could add language that very easily just says sub-metering of property is encouraged for conservation purposes, and leave it at that. And that would be an encouragement to property owners to do it. As Mr. Mechanic said, we did some research as well. The cost of sub-meters is relatively low, so I don't see a financial disincentive to people who may want to do that for conservation purposes and for convenience. Again, a property owner may find it more convenient to bill his tenant based on how much his tenant uses, as opposed to a joint bill for water or electricity or whatever. So minor language tweak to encourage sub-meters is all we would need.
So what we have on the screen there is not exactly what was sent to us in our packet, because we're adding the white to what we have already. Okay.
That would be our recommendation.
Everybody aware of that then? All right.
Yes.
Yes.
Can I just say something? Because it says water conservation. I think I would suggest a suggestion to encourage conservation of water, electricity, and gas.
Kaylee, one question.
Okay, yes.
Has there been any consideration to suggesting that new builds include an ADU?
No, this is the first step just by allowing them. That would be more, I guess, I don't want to use the term aggressive. I mean, not that as a planner I would be against that, because we're about adding more housing. I mean, the biggest, probably the best tool towards combating workforce housing issues is literally to just add more housing stock. So no, this does not encourage that. That could be something the city wants to do in the future. Given the atmosphere, you know, there's some hesitancy over just this. I'm not sure if that would be successful, but it's something we could certainly look at.
Just a thought.
And that one will probably get you into a little more legal hot water. The private property argument.
Just one additional tack on to that. One of the things we're trying not to do is to create conflicts with the subdivisions in the city that have HOAs, that have rules already in place. Mandating something by code that's prohibited by the HOA will create a conflict, which I'm sure the legal department will appreciate because it'll keep them employed. But it's probably not the kind of thing that we want to do. Removing restrictions and providing encouragements, I think, is the best approach to take, and that's kind of what we're focused on at this point in time, and that's what this does.
Any further discussion?
I think Councilman Gambogi had a speaker request form in.
Please.
There are a lot of things going on right now, and I'm going to ask you to hold two opposing thoughts in your mind at one time. One is the government element of workforce housing and the proposal you're looking at, and then there's the marketplace. At the council meeting a couple days ago, I think I cited that there are a drought, a deficit of 7 million of affordable homes. And a lot of that deficit is brought about by major corporations buying up homes, short-term rentals that you mentioned earlier. It seems to be a problem that was created by the government, and we seem to be trying to take governmental measures to try to fix it. Workforce housing is an example. You know, we have, I think, over 500 short-term rentals in Prescott. And there's a short-term rental not too far from me, and it might be occupied one weekend a month, maybe 2 weekends, for a sum total of 4 days out of the full month. If those units were available for housing, it would help the Prescott housing issue a whole lot. I was going to ask the question, well, as part of the overall plan, how many affordable homes do we need? Howard estimated 1,000. But I think there's a marketplace answer to that, and that is, before you get into a complicated government-driven solution to workforce housing or this, I can't see anything but bad consequences to this proposal, the fact that we allow ADUs. There's a marketplace answer to that, and the marketplace answer is pay the police and fire and teachers and healthcare workers market wages here in Prescott, and the rest of it will settle out. Thank you.
Is there a motion concerning this proposed amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion that we approve or request approval, whatever the term is, LDC 24-001, the proposed amendment to the Land Development Code affecting accessory dwelling units, and including the wording to encourage conservation and the use of submeters.
We have a motion. Is there a second?
Susan Graham, I'll second.
We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, Jacob?
Commissioner Hutchinson,
Approve?
Commissioner Graham,
Approve.
Vice Chair Riley,
Approve.
Chair Michaelman,
Approve.
passes 4-0.
I want to thank you, Howard, for bringing your thoughts. We appreciate that.
And I
Next.
apologize, I didn't put the item number on the recommended actions. But Commissioner Riley got it. He's on top of it.
Next up is LDC 24-002, proposed amendment to Land Development Code modifying the definition of floor area gross. Kaylee.
Yes, so this should be a little more simple. So right here is the definition right out of our table 11.2.5, floor area gross. So as you can see, it's just a simple strike through of, the second half of the definition, because our floor area definition by nature has actually been net. So, because you see it excludes all these different areas. Now, the problem this has created mostly is that we have guidelines for accessory structures in our land development code. And particularly, you are limited to a certain square footage of accessory structures in comparison to your principal residence. But what the gross floor area definition currently does is it excludes certain areas from that definition, including vehicle parking. So you could have, say, a home that's 2,500 square feet, but in, say, 500 of it is garage. And per this definition, that garage area would be netted out. However, someone could build a 2,000 square foot RV garage because that's excluded in our gross floor area definition. And maybe like George has a better way of explaining it, but it's a loophole. So in a lot of these accessory structures, a lot of people are wanting them for garages, and we've seen an increase in the people want their hobby garages, their RV garages. And the way the code reads now is you could have unlimited square footage of an accessory garage. The only thing limiting it would be like your maximum lot coverage percentage. So this has been something that has frustrated us as staff for years. And we're like, why don't we just change that? So I am open for any questions. So again, the gross floor square footage, this is a diagram. It's basically everything to the exterior wall planes. Things that wouldn't be part of it are like balconies, decks, patios. But that is all I have.
Questions for staff? Tom.
Yes, Tom Riley. Kaylee, a couple of things. One, does this definition differ from the definition of occupiable space in the International Building Code or the International Residential Code?
Well, it's been a while since I was a building permit tech, but I believe it does because those are more defined. Actually, George, I am going to call on you for this one. I was not expecting that.
You were doing so well. It does differ from that definition, but as Kaylee was starting to explain correctly, the reasons are different. For our situation, we're looking at the structure in relation between the principal and the accessory structures, and the building code's looking at it from strictly a life safety standpoint. If someone can occupy a space, it has different regulations for that occupiable space. So a garage space here under this current definition would be excluded from the floor area of the house. Under the building code, it would not.
Well, I guess I'm trying to understand that. The way that I'm reading this with the strikeout that you have, the garage area would be included.
That's correct.
Okay, and I think that's a problem myself. I think unoccupiable space. I mean, other things that could be included according to this would be if I have a walkout basement and that basement has a ceiling height of greater than 7 feet, which a lot do, but it's just dirt. and it's not occupiable, it's still included as space, according to this definition.
If it meets the top half of the definition, it
And
would
I think that's a
be-
problem.
But again, this definition is gross floor area of the building,
And
and
that's-
that space is part of the gross floor area of the building.
Well, same thing can be said of attic space too. If I have an attic space that is not occupiable but is greater than 7 feet, that's going to be considered part of the gross area. And what that ends up doing is ostensibly increasing the size of an accessory dwelling unit that can be located on the lot. Because the way I understand the definition is the accessory dwelling unit cannot exceed 600 square feet or 50% of the gross square area of the building. So if I have a 2,500 square foot home that has occupiable and I have a 500 square foot garage, or even 1,000 square foot RV garage, I have now increased the size of what I'm allowed to have on my site as an accessory dwelling unit. And so I'm wondering if that is really working in our best interest.
So you're just contemplating another revision to this definition.
Well, it's either that or leave it the way it was. What was wrong with it? What were the problems being caused? What problem are we fixing?
So the problem we were fixing is the purpose of the primary use of this definition is where it relates to principal dwellings versus accessory dwellings, or accessory buildings, principal buildings versus accessory buildings. The current definition, by excluding the vehicle parking areas from both the principal and the accessory, would allow you to have a much larger accessory building because we're not counting it as square footage. It's exempted per this from the gross square footage calculation. So you could have, as Kaylee said, 2,000 square foot house. Typically, if you are talking about just occupiable space and not vehicle parking, you would be allowed to have an accessory dwelling or accessory buildings totaling up to 1,000 square feet, 1/2 of 50%.
So what?
If you eliminate the parking area requirements and say we're not counting the parking spaces, you eliminate the parking area of the principal dwelling if it has a garage built in, but you also ignore all of the parking area for any accessory structures. So you've no longer limited the accessory building to 50% of the principal building. It can be larger than the principal building as long as it's all parking, because none of that parking counts towards the gross square footage.
I mean,
That's what we've been running into in the past. And we've run into it with a lot of private property owners who are confused because they're trying to figure out how big of a secondary building they can put on their property, a garage. And when they read this, it generally doesn't do what gross square footage definition should do.
Well, I guess the question comes up in my mind, why are we limiting it? You're already limited by the amount of building that you can put on a lot. It's already, you just can't build outside the setbacks. But I can fill up everything in between there without any question. So why are we looking to limit that? Why are we looking to change that?
I think more of your question's off just a little bit in that we're already doing that. The code already does that. What we're trying to do is to clarify just what counts towards that effort. So we already limit how large your accessory buildings can be based on the square footage of your principal building. It's
Right.
already a limitation.
Okay.
So we're not creating a new limitation.
Well,
We're
no,
clarifying what can or can't be considered in that limitation. And generally, there are 3 different ways that we control how much of the property is covered by structures. The setbacks. There's also a maximum lot coverage percentage for the site that also affects buildings regardless of what their use is. So you're correct about that. And then this to prevent a secondary building from actually being larger than the principal building. And that's where this would help us.
Well, I guess the question comes in is what is the problem with the accessory building being larger than the main building? So
you
what?
know, I'm going to play devil's advocate, I
Please.
suppose. So you could start getting these garage mahals. They're like, people love their RV garages. That'll start morphing all the residences, and then it starts turning into more of an industrial feel. So
We have actually had a situation in town where someone built a very large RV parking garage was a 2-bay RV parking garage on a single-family lot in a residential neighborhood that caused a considerable amount of angst among the neighbors who came and took it out on us because of this definition. So there is that situation of shouldn't the principal building be larger than accessory buildings? And in theory, principal means first.
George,
Seeing it.
let me ask it a different way. My question is, what is the desired effect of this change?
It is to make sure that accessory buildings don't exceed the size of the principal building.
But you're changing what you count as area of the principal building, and then that would increase the size of the accessory building, wouldn't it?
It
Actually?
potentially could increase the way we calculate both. It won't necessarily increase the size of the building. So if you come to me with a building plan that shows a house with a 2-car garage, the square footage of that 2-car garage is within the house. So it's not getting bigger because we're including the definition of the parking area.
Well, that's a little bit of a word salad, George.
What's that?
That's a little bit of a word salad. I think that the issue here is it may not cause somebody to build a larger piece, but it still allows more area. So basically this change allows the possibility of the accessory dwelling structure to be larger than what's currently allowed by code, the way that this is going to be calculated.
I disagree because we currently discount all of the vehicle parking area for accessory structures. And if they're
You're
primarily
taking
a
that away now.
garage,
You're
Sorry?
taking that away. Now you're going to count that
Now
as
we're
being
gonna
the
count
gross
it.
square footage, that and plus unoccupiable basements, unoccupiable attics. So basically what you do is you're adding more gross square footage to the principal unit, which in turn allows you to build a larger accessory unit, the possibility of one. So if I take a 2,500 square foot home, and I add on to that home, I include the walkout basement, another 500 square feet. You include the garage, another 500 square feet. So now I'm restricted to 50% of a 3,500 square foot home, as opposed to a 2,500 square foot home. So the potential of an accessory building becomes larger.
I understand what you're saying. I do. I think probably the greater threat is probably being able to have an unlimited accessory garage space up to the only thing that will constrain it is the max lot coverage. But I get what you're saying.
But right now,
And-
there is a limit based upon the occupiable space. So if you have a 2,500 square foot house, you have 1,250 square feet that you can build.
Unless it was a garage, like you could build, if you met the setbacks and max lot coverage, you could build like a 3,000 square foot garage.
I thought the accessory building cannot be more than 50% of the occupiable space right now is our.
So the language for accessory building says the gross floor area of the accessory building cannot be more than 50%. So if you're discounting all of the garage space in the accessory building, that doesn't count towards the 50%. So Commissioner Riley is right in that if you're counting more of the main house, it can be a larger square footage of accessory building. But you're now also in the accessory buildings counting the parking areas towards the gross square footage, which again falls more in line with what a gross floor area calculation should be. So I don't see that that's going to increase the size of the building, perhaps,
It's
unless
going
the
to.
building that's being proposed as an accessory building is not parking garage. If it's workshops or
it
guest
seems to
quarters,
me-
then it would be larger.
Excuse me. It seems to me that your issue here is to try to avoid the garage McMansions from being built, or as you put it, garage Mageddon or whatever.
Garage Mahal.
Garage
Garage
Mahal. Garage Mahal being built on a property. Well, address that issue and leave it separate from the accessory dwelling units. address it differently than the way that you're addressing it here. I don't think that this is the best way to address the issue of the overall garage, and perhaps there's something else that you could do for that.
We'd be open to
I
suggestions.
also have a
yes.
question. If we adopted this, how would it affect the real estate industry? Because right now, when you go out to buy a house, it says it is 2,500 square feet. It doesn't include the garage size in there. It doesn't include, like, my house, I have walkout basement that has a cement slab, but it's storage and it's not livable. It doesn't include that in there. Will this change the real estate industry?
No,
Will
they
this
don't.
change the tax basis?
They
too?
don't subscribe to our rules necessarily. Like there's a lot of discrepancies between the MLS and like what the LDC says. Generally, you see that they'll list homes, they'll list everything. You know what I mean? So they want to make you seem like you're getting the most for your money, which makes sense. I don't see that this would have implications on the real estate market.
Could it affect taxes?
That I don't know how the assessor does it. They do their own sketches.
They do an evaluation based on the actual use and not whether or not we count it in a definition. So if it's garage, they will tax it as a garage, and if it's livable space, they tax it as livable space. So this should not affect the taxes, nor should it affect real estate advertising. Again.
Is there a way, you asked for a suggestion, is there a way that we could go back to the LDC definition of the size of an accessory dwelling unit, and simply say that this somehow worked in the garage or vehicle storage cannot exceed something in that area? Wouldn't that be a better way to do that than this?
It's an alternate way. Yes.
We will.
And I think if your issue is garages, then, let's address the vehicle storage in the definition as opposed to opening this up, because I think this opens it up. I think this is going to have the law of unintended consequences is really going to come down on this thing.
And I agree with Tom on this.
Very good.
Okay.
So there you have
Appreciate
it.
your input. We'll go back and look at that other section as well.
So do we want to put this in abeyance then?
You can move to recommend further study, or you could simply not take action on it today, and we'll bring it back to you once we've looked at it again.
Do I hear a motion on this?
I move to table LDC 24-002 to allow for time for staff to look at alternate definitions.
Is there a second?
I second it, Tom Hutchison.
We have a motion and second. Any further discussion? Jacob?
Commissioner Hutchison,
Approve.
Commissioner Graham,
Approve.
Vice Chair Riley,
Approve.
Chair Michaelman.
Approve. Okay. Any updates?
George has an update.
One reminder, we're in the midst of our 60-day public review period for the city's draft general plan. There is a website, planprescott.com, where you can get access to the actual document itself, to a virtual meeting room where you can walk through and look at various sections and provide written comments to us, and we're encouraging the public to please do that. And those of you who are not on the general plan committee, please do that. And we have one more open house, physical open house, to be held at the library on October 24th of this month. So you're welcome to come to that and provide us comments there as well. And thank you to those who participated in manning stations at that location at our last open house. Thank you.
We are now adjourned. Thank you for your attendance.